I want to go back for a second. I know we're entering into
let's do it.
a new. Let me see if I can do this parashat.
There are no rules.
Sha'ai Sarah.
Chayei Sarah.
Hey.
Come on, Nate. This is as you know, the rule is just throw chaz in a bunch of
Chayei Sarah. Yeah, actually, I want to start by asking this question. I wanted to ask it last episode, and we went on a tangent as that happens. But Abram to Abraham,
Yep.
and Sarai to Sarah, right? Not a big change. In the Hebrew, is there a significant change? What is the difference between Abram and Abraham?
It's small.
Mhm.
The difference is the letter hey. In Hebrew, the name Abraham, the name Abram is spelled with 4 letters. The name Abraham is spelled with 5 letters. The difference is that the letter hey, which makes a huh sound, like an H, is added in. And the difference between Sarai and Sarah also is they're both 3 letters, but Sarai has the letter yud at the end, which is like a Y, and the name Sarah has a hey at the end, which is like a letter H. And that letter hey is added to both of their names. And there's, I mean, as you can imagine,
lots of theories and reasoning.
Exactly.
Yeah,
what
I look
means.
at it, from a simplistic point of view. I look at it like, okay, I'm starting with you, and I don't need to change a lot, but I need to change something about you. There's something that needs to change about you, Abraham. It's you're there, but you need an addition to who you are.
Yeah.
And so it's a small addition, but that addition makes all the difference in the world, you know. The changing of a name, but also just like, you know, there's a you that existed before you knew who I was, and there's a different you that still looks the same, but you're completely different. Just on the fact of this one letter addition, maybe. I don't know. That's how I kind of, view it.
The way I think about it is sometimes, you know, when we think of the journey of faith, it just seems like a daunting thing. Like to change everything about my life and everything's got to be different. Sometimes you really just got to change one thing. And that's not the whole journey. It's definitely not. I mean, think about Abraham and Sarah. That name change happens pretty early in the journey. I mean, after that is like a million. It's Abimelech and it's the binding of Isaac and all that stuff. So, but sometimes you just need to make that one intentional change, and that can make all the difference. I remember actually when I was growing up, the elementary school that I went to, it was a lovely school, but you know, it was like a challenging, kind of like a little more challenging religious environment. And one of the things I remember is that, so in the Jewish community, when you pray 3 times a day, so when we're praying to God, there's a tradition that if you've seen observant Jews praying, they're often swaying. In there's a term called shuckling. Exactly, it's often shuckling like that, like looking like this. If you're looking at home, you may have seen it at the airport.
I get in the habit of doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why.
It's almost meditative.
It is. It's meditative, and it's almost in a sense of the sway of movement kind of, and my focus of the sway of movement allows me to disconnect from everything else around me to some degree. I find myself doing it naturally. It's
exactly. It's very powerful. So I remember growing up in that school. So it wasn't like cool to pray. Like it wasn't cool to look as if you were enjoying.
I don't know if it's ever like in a modern world. I don't know if it's ever been cool to pray. Just maybe in the Jewish world, there's like, oh man, that guy's cool. He's praying. And you know what? To be fair, when
we're making it cool to pray,
Jewish people do look. You know, they have the talit, they have tefillin. There is a like
we got a whole uniform.
A whole uniform to prayer. You know, which is it's powerful. It separates your normal part of your day. And one thing I love about Judaism is there's constantly ways where you find yourself putting on something to remind yourself that I'm moving away from the normal into something that's sacred, or something that's holy, or something that has should have a different mood and a different feeling to everything I was doing around that. And so, you know, the use of a talit, or, you know, tefillin, or a kippah, and, you know, the religious garments that God instructed the Israelites to wear is a very physical way of reminding the spirit, I'm entering into something different now, and there's a different level of reverence that I need to have in this moment of time because of that.
And those markers, like those intentional markers, are so crucial. So when I was in this school, I remember like it wasn't like I'd always feel very self-conscious about prayer, and so I would never sway. I'd never shuckle
Mm-hmm.
because I would be worried that people around me would, like all my friends, would think it wasn't cool, right? So then for high school, I switched to a different high school, like in a totally different town. I went to high school in Manhattan, and I didn't know. I knew like one kid going there. We were friendly, but like I only knew one kid going. I didn't know anyone else. And I remember getting there that first day, and it was just like a different kind of group of kids, and they all had grown up shuckling, so no one was self-conscious about it. And I remember making a decision on that, literally on that first day of high school. Okay, from now on, I'm going to shuckle when I daven. I'm not going to worry about it. And you know, I was in that kind of environment that made it okay, made me feel okay to do it. But I will, as long as I live, I will never forget. I even remember where I was standing when it happened. I was in the hallway all the way in the end, in front of my 9th grade classroom. And I remember making that decision of like, I'm going to shuckle from now on. And it was a small change. Like you'd think, how big a deal could that be? You're literally just going like this. What's the difference? That one change, that one letter, hey, that one single letter changed my whole relationship to prayer. And truly, like I never felt the same about prayer ever again. So sometimes
and it's also become a marker moment for you now. Like you say, I can almost remember exactly where I was standing, and it's like we have these moments throughout the Tanakh where you realize the patriarchs realize they're having pivotal moments, and they build altars and they mark it.
Yeah,
they're like whatever I just experienced is pivotal to me, and I need to commemorate that with the building of an altar or a marking. It's like a marking to remember this is the moment where this happened, where the shift took place in my heart that ultimately moved the rest of my physical being in a different direction.
Exactly. It's those intentional moments where you take a moment of transcendent feeling and emotion, like like an experience of faith, and you turn it into an action. You say, I'm going to mark this. So crucial. And that's what God does with Abraham and Sarah. He says, listen, we're in a covenant now. Now you could say, okay, knowing that we're in a covenant, that's the pivotal moment. But God says, no. That's the
structure.
The structure.
Yeah.
But we actually have to do something to mark this. I'm going to change your name. It's only one letter, but it's going to fundamentally alter everything. So the question,
it does.
And it does. The question like people should ask themselves is, right now in my journey, what's that one letter, hey, that I can add to my life that can actually shift me onto a different path?
And if I was going to say it, I'd say it's God. There you go. End of the episode. Thanks for joining in.
That was good.
So I'm going to jump back for 2 seconds because I want to go back to how we kind of got to the end of last episode where God swore by himself to Abraham. Abraham was presented with a test. You know, when we look at this is probably, I would say, the first moment from my reading where Abraham crushed it. You know, he trusted God. He was obedient to God's voice, even though logically it didn't quite make sense. He trusted that God's word was stronger than his own perception of what was going on around him. And God continues and doubles down, saying, I'm blessing you just like I told you. And I'm swearing by myself now because there's nothing greater than God. So I can only swear by myself. I can't swear on anything that's greater than me because I am the greatest. And I am therefore going to swear by my own character and nature that I'm going to bless you. At this point of Abraham's story, we also have to go back and say, okay, well, God, you made a lot of promises to Abraham, a people, a land, ownership of this land, a promised son. The promised son has come, but the ownership of the land as God stipulated it, which is, the nation of Israel and the borders that everything he could see, that hasn't really come to fulfillment in this moment of time. And then chapter 23 opens with the tragedy of Sarah's death. She's 127 years old. She lives a full, long life. We're going to talk about Abraham weeping over that. But then we also get to this place where Abraham is now going to purchase this piece of land, Machpelah, which is, modern day Hebron, also ancient Hebron, because it has the same name. That goes to tell you something about how long the Jewish people have been in the land, since the names are the same for a minute. But what we miss is we have to remember that Abraham came from modern day Iraq. And traditionally speaking, when someone dies, you would take them back to the place where they come from. And yet Abraham chooses to purchase a piece of land here, knowing that this is where he belongs and this is where his descendants will ultimately live. So even in the loss of Sarah, Abraham is believing that this is and always will be their home, the land of Israel. And so he's purchasing land to now bury his beloved wife Sarah, who he went through highs and lows with, but it also will be the place of the burial of not only Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, but also Jacob and Leah. And so this will be the burial place of the patriarchs and the matriarchs of the nation of Israel. And it's Abraham's purchase of that land that somehow reveals his complete belief that even though he didn't get to have ownership of the land, his purchase of this land is a belief that God will ultimately come through with that promise to his descendants.
Exactly. Like there's a move that goes on in the Bible a couple of times, which is a person of faith is called on or is given the opportunity or is presented with a scenario where there's going to be trouble ahead. Now, usually when there's trouble ahead, that's the wrong time to invest, right? So the classic example is Jeremiah. As the temple is being destroyed and Jerusalem is being sacked and the people of Judah and the Jews are sent into exile and all of society is falling apart, it's at that moment that God says to Jeremiah, purchase a field from someone named Hanamel, right?
Yes.
Purchase Hanamel's field and invest in property right now in the land of Israel because I am a God who keeps his promises. And this is your sign that you know that. So here,
amazing.
remember what Abraham's been told. This land's going to be yours, but your children are going to be exiles from here and be slaves in another land for hundreds of years.
400,
and only then are they going to come back.
Yeah.
So Abraham might have said, well, I mean, this investment's not going to pay off for hundreds of years, if that, right? But actually now is when and by the way, amazingly, so if you look at chapter 23, he's given the opportunity to get this for free, right? So Ephron the Hittite, who's the owner originally of the field in the cave of Machpelah, is willing to give it to him for free. And Abraham says, no, I want to pay money. And he, if you look in verse 13, Ephron had just offered Abraham to buy the field for free. And Abraham says, and he speaks to Ephron in earshot of all of the people of the land, saying, if you, I'm asking you to listen to me. I'm going to give you money, take my money, and I will bury my dead there. Because Abraham says, actually, I want to show that I believe that I'm coming back, or I believe in a God who keeps his promises.
Yeah, and he also wants to publicly declare that I am paying in full whatever the asking price is. This belongs to me, paid in full.
You and I especially, we know this game, right? We know the game of people trying to make it seem like Abraham and his descendants, the Jewish people, do not belong here. We know that game.
Yes.
And Ephron's trying to do this, like, oh, like I'll give it to you.
Yeah, it's all right, just take it, use it for a bit. But there's no guarantee that whatever's discussed between two people in that moment is going to stand.
By the way, to this day, the Jewish community of Hebron is the most ancient Jewish living community in this land. It's been here for 3,500 years. There's been a continuous Jewish presence in that city.
I don't think people quite grasp what you just said. 3,000 years.
By the way, think about it. 3,000 years ago, that community had been there for 500 years already.
Yeah. So 3,500 years of a community engaging with this region of Israel, and you struggle. Your mind struggles to even go. I struggle to remember things I did 2 weeks ago.
Right.
But to think 3,500 years ago, this event was unfolding, and that it has an impact today is also one of those moments where you're like, oh, these stories in Genesis are so often put into like myth, legend, the sort of Disneyland-esque, like, oh, but it's not, is it real? No. You can visit Hebron. You can go to the tomb of the patriarchs.
You can literally see it.
Yeah, and that place is, even to this day, still a point of contention. But Abraham's faith in God's promise was that despite the time frame that he's going to do it in. Now, why would Abraham have so much confidence that? Because he had to wait 25 years for Isaac. So now he's understanding, oh, it's not on my clock, it's on yours. And so my purchase is only me showing faith that whatever else you haven't come good on is only a matter of time.
Mm-hmm.
So again, Abraham, is believing, and so much of that I think comes with God saying, like, do you get it now? I've intervened. I've come into your story. I've made a series of promises. I've shown you that every single promise I've made has come to pass, and all I required is for you to believe. And so I feel like the beginning of this chapter shows that. But then we also have the tragedy of death.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I read. I wasn't a strong believer in Christianity in my early days of Christianity, because I was like everybody else. I would, go to church service. Everything I knew is only what the pastor taught. That was it. That was, if he talked about Jesus walking on water, okay, I know that. And I would only learn from them. And it wasn't until 2016 where I got to the place in my faith journey where I was like, I need to actually read this. I need to read this text and understand it. And it wasn't until then that I realized there is so much to gain from a personal relationship with reading this text. And over and over again, as I dive into the text, I continue to realize how much I can learn from these stories that are so important for me to grasp and understand that, there's a reason why God created a book such as this. And there's a reason why so much of what we've even talked about isn't necessarily written on the page.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
It's not like it says, and Abraham purchased this because he knew that God's promise was going to come good at a certain point. And it's like it leaves it in a way where it really requires someone to dig to get to the heart of what God's saying. And it's not just like I dig once and I'm like, oh, there, now I found it. It's like a constant, some of the stuff we've talked about, I'd be like, wow, I never thought about the fact that Abraham didn't tell Sarah about.
Right. It's like one of those things where
you just don't, because you're just read
the text
the
doesn't
stories.
say, by the way, Abraham didn't tell Sarah. Like the text wants you to go on this journey and it wants you to ask questions.
And it wants you to come back.
And it wants you to come back again and again and again.
And it wants you to see the whole story. And then when you understand the whole story and you start shaping what God is doing, then you can actually go back to the details and go, because I've gone, like Jeremiah, perfect example. We God again will say, purchase the land. Why? Because you're coming back. And so it really does require a full, exhaustion of the text before you can even begin to start enjoying the treasures that God has. And just like Abraham's story, God is found in the details. It's not enough to just be like, okay, so Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, death, and moving on. It's like there's these little details that are hidden for believers to be like, oh wow, now I see what you're doing. It's not for everyone. Jesus has this famous saying, he who has ears, let him hear. Well, everyone's got ears, but who's listening?
Right.
And there's a difference between receiving information and understanding the information that you've received to decode what is really being said. Like, I'm an actor, so life is all about the subtext. What my character is saying is not necessarily what my character is feeling, and sometimes what's not being said is just as powerful as what is being said to shape my motivation and my intentions. So the death of Sarah, it's tragic because now we go back to the reality, oh yeah, people die.
Right.
And so as I was saying, the first time I read through this text, I read the entire Torah, the Tanakh, and the New Testament in 28 days, which is fast.
Yeah,
I think
quick.
It's like, but every day I just read it, and I got.
And by the way, people should know, that actually is the best way to read this text the first time.
Yep.
Just get through it
all the way,
and then you'll come back and you'll find all the nuggets.
And don't think to yourself, I need to understand everything. Wow, the first 5 readings of the Bible, I was like, huh?
Right.
Like, especially when you get to a talking donkey, you're like, I'll come back to that later.
All right, Bible.
Yeah. But you have these things where you realize it's not about understanding everything. It's about getting through everything first and then going back. But when the first time I read through the Bible in 28 days, I'd become so attached to the figures and characters that I was reading with that there was a moment of like, oh, Sarah's dead.
Yeah.
Like I've tracked with Abraham and Sarah or Moses. Moses, at the end of Deuteronomy, if you just read the entire Torah in a short, yeah, you're like, oh, he was so like, he was my guy. Like I was fighting for him, and even though you know how the story ends, it still hits you in a different way where you're like, death.
Yeah.
Humans still have that problem of death, and Abraham has to deal with that dilemma, which takes us back to like Adam and Eve. If you eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, surely you will die. Yeah. Same problem.
Yeah.
You know, like the victory isn't like, yes, Abraham had faith. He did it. And then it's like, and Sarah dies.
You gotta think of these figures as like Greek heroes, right? They're either tragic figures, and like their death is like the whole point of the story, or they're like immortal demigods, right? And they never, like Hercules never dies, right? So like you think of, you know, the Bible is so different because the Bible is real. The Bible is real people. Abraham was a man who lived. Sarah was a woman who lived.
Yes, real people with real experiences that we get a window into points of their life. The other thing is we read over certain aspects of the story because we're reading it and we're not living it. Right. So it's like, you know, Abraham was 75 when God first came to him, and then he's like 100 when he has, you know, Isaac. You know, it's 25 years.
Yeah, we've been with this guy for a while.
Yeah, but we read it in like 20 minutes.
Right,
and so 25, there's so much that goes on that we're not like, you know, like thinking to yourself, okay, yeah, like God promised me this, but would you really wait 25 years? And so then you kind of track back and go, oh man, like as much as Abraham did fail, you also understand that it was a task. Like 25 years in the waiting for a son, who would be that patient? Who would actually be like, no, I trust God? And, you know, like I think at a certain point, you know, a lot of believers, we have this tendency to be like, you know, we pray and we're like, hey, God, you know, like we often ask for things, or we have situations in our life, and our desire is that God would solve the issues or bring the things that maybe we feel that we need or desire in that moment of time.
Yeah.
And what we see is God's not a vending machine. It's not like I'm going, duh, cool, great, got it, thank you.
Exactly.
He's like, this is not about the things you can get or the timing in which you get them. It's about a journey of discovering who you are in the context of who you were created in the image of, which is me. And so we miss that sometimes in scripture.
There's a really wonderful metaphor in the Jewish tradition. So my teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, has this great concept where he says, he points out that in the Jewish tradition, so, you know, every single person in the Jewish world is compared, and you could make the same analogy for any nation or any community. Every single person is compared to a letter in a Torah scroll. Right? So we talked about this in a previous episode, but if you're going back to 2,000 years, 2,500 years, you go back to the time of Ezra, you go back to the first century, you go back to, you can look at the Gospels, Book of Acts, and you see people reading from the law in the synagogue. What they were doing was the Jewish people were taking out, you know, every single week and two times during the week and then once on the Sabbath, or twice on the Sabbath, they would take out a scroll, like a parchment scroll, and they would read from the Hebrew words of the Torah. Now, the law in Jewish tradition is that a Torah scroll, if it's missing a letter, the entire thing is unusable. Now, that's a strange thing, Rabbi Sachs pointed out, because he said in biblical Hebrew, unlike in English, there is no such thing as a Hebrew word that's just one letter. So in English, you have the word or the word I, but in Hebrew, there's no such thing as a word that's only one letter, which means that in the entire Torah, one letter missing actually doesn't mean that there's any word missing. It means a word is misspelled, but there's no word missing. So he says, on the one hand, the entire scroll working depends on every single letter. Now, every single person alone can't make up a full word. But if you put a few letters together, you get a word. If you put a few words together, you get sentences. And if you put a couple sentences together, you get paragraphs. And if you put a couple paragraphs together, you get a story. The same thing is true for a community. One individual on his or her own cannot accomplish anything in in the story of faith. But if you put a couple individuals together, you get a family. You put a couple families together, you get a community. You put a couple communities together, you get a nation, and a couple nations together, and you get history. And so what Abraham realizes is that he's a letter in the scroll. And what he's doing is he's writing his letter knowing that it won't be complete in his lifetime. There's just no way. There's nothing he can do that could make the story come full circle in his lifetime. But he's writing a letter because he knows the next generation will write the next letter. And that those two letters will make a word, and altogether it'll make a story. So to me, that like, you know, when you talk about Abraham making, you know, taking that leap and knowing that God will validate those promises and bring them full circle, this is really the place where you see it most directly.
Understanding that he's a generational God. I may not be a generational being at this point in my faith or, you know, my spiritual journey to the true creator, but he's a generational God with a story to complete. And
by the way, that's why the two things, what are the only two things that Abraham does in response to the death of Sarah? He buys a plot of land in Israel and he finds a wife for his child. Right? Because he's saying, I understand my story's over now. And that's okay. As long as I know that I'm part of a larger story.
And the end of Abraham's story, the last thing Abraham will say is this commandment that he gives to his servant to go and find Isaac a suitable bride. Right? It's suitable bride. I'm always like, you know, when you're reading through Genesis, you know, Sarah is described as beautiful. Rebecca described as very beautiful. You know, Rachel described as very beautiful. There's a lot of attractive women in the book of Genesis. You know, if it was, but let's talk about this idea of, you know, Abraham's story coming to an end, Abraham realizing now the story goes to the focus of Isaac. And to be fair, Isaac's an interesting figure in the Genesis story, where we go into the details pretty heavily of Abraham as the father of faith. And we have this build-up of this promised son who ultimately will become Isaac. And Isaac kind of acts in a lot of ways, when I read the text, as this linchpin between Abraham to Jacob. And his story is a lot smaller, a lot less detailed than these two other figures. You know, the journey of Abraham with God and Jacob, who will also ultimately have a name change. You know, and Isaac kind of uniquely sits in the middle of these two figures. You know, how does you know, Jewish traditions kind of look at these three figures in that sense, where you have so much emphasis on Jacob's story, so much emphasis on Abraham's story, and Isaac kind of who sits in the middle?
Like, a good friend of mine once observed about Isaac that he's the ultimate rabbi's kid, right? Or I suppose in the Christian tradition, he's the ultimate pastor's kid, right? Because if you look at Isaac's story in the Bible, you know, in the coming chapters, it's just a repeat of Abraham's life.
In a lot of ways. Like he'll make the say, like he'll be like, oh no, this is my my sister. Not my...
exactly. And in so many ways, you know, Abraham contemplates going to the land of Israel. Isaac contemplates leaving the land of Israel. Abraham Abraham has to journey because of a famine. Isaac has to journey because of a famine. Abraham says, my wife is my sister, as a way to find protection. Isaac says, my wife is my sister. Abraham digs wells. Isaac digs wells. Abraham gets into a conflict with the local chieftain. Isaac gets the whole thing. Abraham has a younger child that he chooses over the older child. Isaac has a younger child that he chooses over the older child. Their lives are identical. Now, we've said this in a previous episode. If you're like, you know, a Bible scholar who has no clue what literature is, right? So you'll be like, oh, well, it must be that they were like the same individual in two different versions of the story.
That's what some Bible scholars say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, because Bible scholars like
I mean, I would never hate a Bible scholar. Wow. Some Bible scholars trigger me.
Bible scholars have never.
We're going to have to do an episode. Maybe this is the episode where we just Bible scholars who, you know, will use, you know, a large vocabulary and
a patronizing tone
to convince you that everything that you're reading is absolutely not accurate, not what you think it is. And they'll take you down paths which, you know, in their own way are doing things that are just like, well, you're just creating a theory of your own based on a couple of dudes who sit in a room who have no relationship with God. I find so often Bible scholars are the least faithful people, which is strange to me.
They're also not
because they're not in it for the same reason.
Yeah, they're also deeply not knowledgeable. Many of them.
No, well, they read a research paper and then they represent that research paper without really kind of, having any opinion of their own.
All right, I'm gonna look straight down camera. Bible scholars do not know anything that you don't know. There are no secret texts. Like, there aren't texts that they've discovered. And if there are Akkadian texts, you can read them all in translation. It's not like there's some secret, source of information that you don't have. Like, they're just reading these texts and they're interpreting them poorly. So in any event, this is one of those cases. Like, Bible scholars never met a text they didn't want to butcher. So this is one of those examples. But if you actually read the text sensitively and as an artistic masterpiece, which it obviously is, what you see is such depth and poignancy in the fact that Isaac, of all people, repeats his father's life.
And where do we see this? We see this in our lives. When I'm focused on doing something as a task on my phone or whatever, my girlfriend will often be like, "Oh, your mouth's always open when you're really focused." I'm like this. And I don't know why I do it, right? I don't know why. I really don't. I don't even realize I'm doing it. One day my mom said, and my dad left when I was a little kid. I was 2 when he left, but my mom said, "Your dad did the same thing."
Wow.
And so you realize that, like, I have no relationship with my father and I never spent time with him to kind of get that from him, but I have the same tendencies by default as my father. And so even though I don't know him, never met him, never saw him do it, I'm doing something that was similar to him in some shape or form. And you hear this all the time with, fathers and sons and mothers and daughters. They sometimes have these tendencies. And what we see is the Bible is revealing this, that, Isaac wasn't there when Abraham was like, no, she's my sister. So, but he has this tendency because he is from his father. And that generational pattern of human nature is being passed down. And so I think it's actually amazing that the Bible reveals these things where it's like, that might sound like the same story, but it's like, remember, Isaac is Abraham's son, like father, like son,
That's beautiful. And think about it. So when I said earlier that Isaac's the ultimate, rabbi's kid, pastor's kid, it's so not easy, but in many ways it's easier to be Abraham than it is to be Isaac, right? Because notwithstanding all the challenges and despite all of the heartache, you're still a trailblazer. The whole world remembers Abraham. I mean, we like when we're trying to be like super polite and geopolitical, like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Abrahamic faiths, right? Abraham is known the world over. Isaac is not. I mean, believers know who Isaac is, but Isaac's not nearly as famous as Abraham. And the most famous episode in the life of Isaac is actually a story about Abraham, the binding of Isaac, right? The near sacrifice of Isaac. That's an Abraham story. Isaac's kind of a side character in that. Isaac's challenge is in many ways so much greater than Abraham's, right? To be the rabbi's kid, the pastor's kid. So everyone knows your parent, right? They get all the attention. And oftentimes they'll look at you. My grandfather was a really, really well-known Jewish theologian. He's the greatest American Jewish orator in the history of American Jewry. He was the president of Yeshiva University, which is the flagship Jewish university. Renowned the world over. When people say Rabbi Lamm, they're not talking about me. They're talking about him. And on the one hand, that's a legacy I'm just deeply, deeply, deeply proud of. But there always is something in the back of your head that says, I know I'm never going to be as great as that. I mean, I know I will never be as great as that. And so I'm ultimately just playing for second place. That's a hard thing to swallow. It's a hard pill to swallow,
but
right?
It's also an interesting thing in the sense that, it seems as though, especially in the story of the binding up of Isaac, he's obedient to his father. He doesn't,
and that's it,
kind of take charge. He doesn't go, you know what, like I'm going to do this my way. He fits into the very specific role, which is the son.
Yeah.
And the son is going to be obedient to the father.
And that's it. Living in many ways, that's why Isaac is really the greatest hero of all of the patriarchs, because he just lives a quiet, unglamorous life of faith.
Unglamorous. Yeah. He had no majesty that we would
everything he did, Abraham already did.
Yeah.
But it was all the more important that Isaac did it, because in some ways, on the one hand, like, yeah, you can't have anything without a trailblazer. But if the trailblazer blazes a trail, but nobody follows, nobody walks that path, then it was all for nothing. Abraham's entire life is validated by the choices that Isaac makes to imitate him, to mimic him. Because ultimately, Isaac's not going to get the glory, but what's going to ensure that Abraham's glory lasts is Isaac. I mean, faith and goodness is almost always unglamorous. Almost always.
Yeah.
And the challenge we have to pose for ourselves is in those moments where no one's going to applaud and no one's going to know, and it's not going to be on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. In those moments, are you going to choose the right thing? I mean, those are the questions. I mean, those are the questions I struggle with every single day.
Well, and I think, Isaac's story is this, it's short and sweet, but it has significant impact.
Yeah.
Everything about Isaac has significant impact moving forward and understanding the past. And again, Isaac sits in this middle seat, which is pivotal to the story of Abraham and will be pivotal in moving the story forward to that of Jacob, where a nation will ultimately be born. But without Isaac in the middle, it's impossible. And he doesn't necessarily get the glory I think he deserves.
Yeah.
But but it seems like that's what God's saying, that there's figures in these stories that are crucial, but they're never going to be celebrated as they should, purely because of what goes before them and what comes after them. But that doesn't mean they're not important. And so, Isaac is in my eyes some of that story playing out. Now, the courting of Rebecca, why is it so important that Abraham finds this suitable bride? And it's the first time in Genesis where we kind of get a sense of a love story. We don't really have right. Abraham kind of we get it. Abraham obviously loves Sarah,
but we meet them like in media res. Like we meet them.
Yeah,
in the
we
middle
meet
of the
him.
story.
Yeah, we meet them at an old age where we don't get to meet Abraham at a young. He's 21. He's like, hey, I saw you getting water from the well. Like, what's your name? What we find.
Classic pickup lines.
Yeah, classic. But we see that, well, first of all, let's talk about the call to action from Abraham's servant. Right? Abraham sits down, this servant who goes unnamed, mysterious figure. Again, the Bible leaves these people, they go, okay, I'm not going to give you his name. And I always think when the Bible doesn't give a name, there's a reason for it.
Yep.
There's something about this figure that will be maybe a hyperlink later on, or he's playing a role that we need to understand from a functional point of view.
You want to know the Jewish tradition about this?
Here we go. Hit me. Because that's what I was hoping.
Okay, so this is the funniest thing.
It's Shem. No. He's still around.
By the way, that would be such a great bit if the Jewish tradition about every single biblical character was like, it's Shem.
People who don't understand stuff will be like, I don't get it. Watch another episode.
Exactly. So in the way I grew up, so you grew up learning all the Jewish interpretive traditions about these texts. And Jewish interpretive tradition, and we'll talk about it in more detail in some later episodes because it becomes super interesting and intense. But what I love about them is they're deeply morally serious, but they're also really whimsical. And they're actually meant to get you to start weaving stories on stories on stories. We think about commentaries as really dry, and this means that and that means this. But ancient Jewish commentary, the kind of commentary that any of the characters, even in the Gospels or the letters of Paul would have been aware of, and certainly in the Jewish tradition, they knew biblical interpretation.
And the commentaries do come out in those texts. Peter, John, Paul, they all make references to interpretive understandings of the text.
Yeah, of course.
Often, which is,
and they're like associative, they're whimsical, they're story based. So in any event, one of the classic things is that when you're a kid in the Jewish community, like when you're older, they teach you the difference between, like we learn the difference between the symbol meaning in the text and then the the moral and legendary kind of like and story-based imaginative embellishments in the text, because they're all meant to teach you serious moral lessons. But when you're a kid, you don't learn the difference between them because it's just complicated to teach the difference. So when you're a kid, you grow up thinking that all these stories are in the Bible that aren't in the Bible, and then only when you're in like a later grades do you learn. So growing up, I remember the first time I read through the Bible, and I was like, wait a minute. Abraham isn't thrown into a fiery furnace and survives. Like, that's not in the Bible.
Right.
And you're like, what are you, now you're looking at me like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. I'm like, Daniel?
Yeah. Right. So Daniel, so what ancient Jewish tradition for thousands of years has always done is it's tried to connect different stories in the Bible to show you that they're actually, that each one can teach you something about the other. So there's an ancient legend that Abraham, as a young man, before God encountered him, before he encountered God, was thrown into a fiery furnace by Nimrod, by the Nimrod, king of Babylon.
Right.
It was like the chief idolater of the age. Like we meet him, he's in a character earlier in Genesis, right?
Great warrior.
Warrior.
First of the mighty men.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on account of Abraham's faith, he emerged unharmed from the furnace.
Right.
Now, where does that story come from? You said that's in the book of Daniel. That's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I guess.
Yeah.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Right. Yeah.
So in those cases,
and they say that the fourth figure in the fire is Abraham. Is that the claim?
Well, no. So what the rabbis do is they just kind of take that story and they say that's what happened to Abraham. Now, they're not saying that literally happened to Abraham.
Okay.
Why are they telling that story?
Right.
What they're pointing to is the fact that by telling that story, they're saying we are trying to provide a reason why God chose Abraham. And what they're pointing to in telling that story in a whimsical way, again, in like a fun, imaginative way, but a morally serious way, is saying, what we want you to realize by telling you this story, that this is what Abraham did before he ever encountered God, is that actually the Bible does not tell us why God chose Abraham. It's a huge mystery, and it should bother us, right? We talked about that in the previous episode. So this is another example where the Bible does not tell us the identity of Abraham's servant. Now, my kids, if you like, I study Bible with my kids every single day. I was just studying this chapter with my daughter. And she refers to the servant by name as Eliezer. And I don't correct her yet. I'll correct her when she's older. I don't correct her yet. I mean, I've told her that that's not his real name, but why does she call him Eliezer? Because earlier, and I think it was, I can't remember which chapter it's in.
He has a servant, Eliezer.
Yeah, that's right. Eliezer
who's
from
going
Damascus.
to be the one who's going to provide, who he thinks is going to be the heir.
Inherit his
That's all
house.
he has. Yeah,
exactly. So what Jewish tradition does is it says, well, we know earlier in Genesis that Abraham has a servant. His name is Eliezer. So this must be that servant. Now, was this actually that servant? We don't know. But why is that an important connection to make, even if it's not the simple meaning of the verses? Is because what the Jewish tradition is trying to emphasize is that this is a story about Abraham sending an anonymous servant who has no incentive other than doing Abraham's will. Yeah. To go on this crazy journey to ensure Abraham's legacy. The rabbis are saying is he may have been the person who actually stood to lose from all of this, right? Like by Abraham securing his heir's legacy, that meant that this servant was going to lose. If this servant was Eliezer, who was going to lose everything, right? Because now it was all going to go to Isaac and Isaac's children with Rebekah. And so it just points up the loyalty.
The stakes are higher now.
Yeah, and you see that this servant is performing just an unbelievable kindness for his master.
So the reward of the servant is purely to please the master.
Yeah, it's just to do a good thing,
even at a cost. Which is like, ultimately, if Isaac does find this love, starts a family, then I'm out.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, right. Interesting.
Yeah.
In the English, it's like he puts the hand of his servant on his thigh, right? Inner thigh.
Yeah.
Awkward? or is
Very.
obviously, or is that just
No, we know archaeological, like from the ancient world.
That's like how you go. This is serious.
Inner thighs.
Inner thigh.
Euphemistic.
It's like, well, and also I guess it gets you into the situation where it's like, we're here now. Like if your hand is here, we're there.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe it's also just like if it's uncomfortable, there's more chance that you're going to remember that moment because you're like let's say it's Eliezer, he leaves Abraham's tent and he's like, that was awkward. All right.
Anyway.
Hey, Ron. We're off. People who understand the Bible will be laughing. Other people will be like, I still don't get it. Read the Bible. Right. So as we go and we track down, what do we really see in this story? We see God's sovereignty again. There's a prayer made, a request made. Hey, if this is how it's going to happen, then this is my sign. There's a request and there's a fulfillment of that request. Everything fits in, and we have this story of Isaac finding his partner, which I think is essential again, about this idea of partnership and God establishing this relational union between a man and woman. And also it comes at a pivotal time for Isaac because he's mourning the loss of his beloved mother, and he's comforted by a new part of his life, which is ultimately going to be his wife. And, the Hebrew text talks about, Isaac goes into the tent with Rebecca and they're married.
Right.
No wedding, no hopper, nothing like that. It's just like we're in the tent, they're married. It's official. Now we find out that Rebecca is also facing the same issue as Sarah did. She's barren.
Yeah.
But again, as the reader of the text, I guess what we should be doing is going, oh, well, that's not a problem.
Right.
God solved that problem, but yet the characters are going through that. And we find Isaac praying and God answering Isaac's prayer. So we again see that Abraham had clearly demonstrated to Isaac the principles of communicating and the relationship with God.
When we get to the next parasha, we can talk about that relationship between Isaac and Rebecca because
starts off well.
Yeah, it starts off well, but you can start to see kind of the echoes of that Abraham and Sarah relationship where the struggle is always to be on the same team. But what's interesting is that, like you said before, we don't ever get to see the beginning of Abraham and Sarah's relationship. But we do get to see the beginning of Isaac and Rebecca's relationship. Now, when the servant finds Rebecca, so the servant is dispatched by Abraham with this seemingly arbitrary
mission, task.
Yeah. And the criteria are weird, meaning like Abraham says, don't take a wife for Isaac from the Canaanite women. Find someone from my hometown. Why? Meaning, is it like an ethnic thing? Like, why?
Yeah.
Now, we know from epigraphy, from archaeology, from the historical practice, we actually know quite a bit about Canaanite society.
Not pretty.
Not at all. The defining character, and this is true, by the way, also of Egyptian society, which was deeply influencing Canaanite society at the time, because Egypt had a great deal of influence and, in some cases, military control over parts of over much of the Levant during this time. And we know the same thing is true also in Mesopotamia. Canaanite society, and this is historically, this is the late Bronze Age. Canaanite society is deeply hierarchical, and it's an unbelievably exploitative society, both in terms like physically, sexually, in terms economically, like it's deeply exploitative.
It's the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Let us all come together so we can make a great name for ourselves. Hey, you don't realize, but we're going to take advantage of you.
Exactly.
Right.
Like
exploitation is probably the best way to,
Yeah. Like,
on every level.
Oh, let's all make bricks together, except I'm the master and you're going to be literal slaves.
Yeah, no, get to
being
work.
Forced to make. Exactly.
Yeah.
So Abraham sees Canaanite society, which is just deeply sick at this time. And he says, I do not want any part of that. Now remember, we talked about this in the last episode. Abraham's challenge was remembering that Sarah was his full and equal partner. And even though he struggled with that, and this is the greatness of Abraham, even though he struggled with that his entire life, he wanted better for his son. He wanted his son to have a partner who would match him and be his equal in every way, and who would make him better and whom he could make better in turn. And so what he says is, on the one hand, don't find somebody from in this society, because this society is not into equality. Like, they don't believe in equality and equal partnership, and sort of that every single human being bears the divine image. Like, this is not a society that believes in that.
No.
I need you to go back to my family. Now, my family, they're back in the home country. Like, they also are still within that pagan lifestyle, right?
Right.
So what the servant intuits correctly that Abraham is asking him, and, like you see when the servant kind of sets out, like in chapter 24, verse 14, the servant sort of says, who's the kind of person that I'm going to choose for Isaac? And it will be the young lady to whom I say, give me something to drink. And she says, drink, but I'm also going to give your camels to drink. That one will be the right person for Isaac. What the servant correctly understands is that what Isaac's asking is not, I need, this nationality, but not that nationality. What he's asking is, I need someone of this type of character and not that type of character. And the character that Abraham's looking for is kindness. What the servant looks for primarily is, he says, I need to find somebody who's kind. And when he finds Rebecca and finds that she's kind, the first thing that he asks her, if I recall, yes, in verse 23, he sees that she's kind. She gives him to drink. She gives his camel to drink, and she keeps going back to the well, which is hard labor, until she finally is able to feed all these camels. I mean, I remember learning this with my daughter the other day. Like, the number of camels that the servant brought drink like 140 gallons of water. You know what I mean? Like, she's doing back-breaking labor, but all in the service of being kind to this stranger. And what's the next question that he asks her? He says, in Hebrew, bat mi'at, whose daughter are you? Please tell me. And she tells him, and she says, I'm the daughter of Bethuel. And so he finds out that she's from the family of Abraham, and he breathes a sigh of relief, right? Because what he realized, why does he care? Meaning, she's kind, just bring her back, who cares? The answer is, it's not like she comes from a lineage and therefore like only people who are born with a silver spoon in their mouth are good enough for Abraham. What the servant understands, and what Abraham understands, is that you want to find someone with great values who has surrounded themselves with other people who can support that. And it's like what we said about Lot, right? You should choose an environment that's supportive for you. It doesn't mean that virtue can't survive in a barren environment. It's just that it's difficult. And Abraham understood, and the servant understood, that Isaac, like we said, was going to walk a lonely path. He was like a sole, solitary believer in a land of power-hungry pagan maniacs. And he needed somebody who could be his partner in that. And that's Rebecca. She's personified by kindness and understands how to live in that environment.
There's also a great deal of trust within this story from both Abraham and the servant, that the responsibility of God is going to figure this out. That we don't fully understand the details of the circumstances of how this is going to unfold, but we realize that this is part of God's story. This is God's plan. So he's going to ultimately be the one that is going to get all these puzzle pieces and put them together. We need to go. We need to seek this person out, but it's ultimately going to be God who reveals all these things, and there's that trust. I remember the first time after I had read the entire Torah Tanakh Bible cover to cover, there was one word that just resonated over and over again to me, which I could not get out of my head, which was basically what drove me on this entire journey I've been on for the last 7 years, which was Israel. Israel and the word Israel, the formation of this people, the covenant relationship that God was establishing from Genesis, all the way through to Malachi, and throughout the New Testament, is that the story of God is deeply connected to Israel, and it's an Israel I didn't know, and an Israel I didn't understand, and a people, prior, to 2017, I knew Jewish people, but I had no relationship with Jewish people. I would know nothing about the Torah, nothing about the Tanakh. I couldn't tell you what you were wearing on the top of your head or why you were having, cotton strings hanging from the sides of your clothes, But it was Israel that I couldn't get out of my mind. I remember sitting in church. I went to church one day, and I felt that God had called me to go and experience not only the land but the people and this place, and I felt like I was called. It's like here I am,
Hineni.
Hineni.
That moment.
It's the Hineni moment, and I remember sitting in the parking lot of a church in Atlanta, and I'd already booked a flight to Israel.
Wow.
But I had no plans, and I had no idea what I was going to do, where I was going to go, how I was going to get around, nothing. No plans, but a flight was booked. And I remember praying to God in my car saying, God, I feel like you've called me to go to Israel, but the details, I have no idea. And so I said, I need you to help me in this moment of time. I'm going to go into church today, and you're going to introduce me to someone who is at least going to put me on the right path, so I have purpose and direction to this task that I feel that you've given to me. And I remember getting out of my car, closing the door in confidence that although I didn't know what was about to happen, I was trusting that God had a plan ahead of me that was going to facilitate exactly what he needed me to do. So I walk into church. I see a friend of mine who I'd known for some years. I went up to him, and his name was Leighton, and he was talking to this young, blonde-haired American kid.
That does have such a cool name.
Yeah. Well, this kid was called Trevor, right? So my friend Leighton says, "Hey, this is my friend Trevor," and I was like, "Hey, Trevor, how you doing?" And he's like, "Good." And he was, he was a young 21-year-old kid at the time. I think I was 33. So he was
Wow.
He was young. He was a kid, and I was like, all right, well, nice to meet you, Trevor. Leighton, I'll see you later. I went over and say hello to another friend, this girl called Jordan. And I was like, well, we got chatting. I was like, I'm going to Israel. And, and I had just come back from Iraq at that point. And she said, oh, you're going to Israel? She goes, you should go and speak to Trevor. He just got back from Israel, and he was there for 6 months.
Really?
And I was like, what? That blonde-haired kid? And she's like, yeah, and he's going to Iraq in a few months as well. And I was like, that kid's going to Iraq? I was like, because I just got back from Iraq. It was crazy. It was 2016. I was, working with an organization bringing emergency aid to people fleeing ISIS. And I thought, I thought I was going to get kidnapped in Iraq. This kid's he had long blonde hair. I was like, you're a target before you even get off the plane. So I ran back to this kid, Trevor, and I said, hey, I heard that you lived in Israel for 6 months. He was like, yeah, I went there and I lived in Nazareth, and I just kind of discovered the land, and I drove around and I met lots of people, and I was like, dude, I got to tell you something. I'm going to Israel. I'm going in less than a month. I have no idea what I'm doing, where I'm supposed to go. All I kind of feel like is I've got to go and document it. I've got to go and take photos. I've got to go and shoot video, take photos. And he's like, that's weird. And I was like, why? He's like, I remember God asking me to take photos, but I'm not a photographer. And I was like, really? So we bonded in an instant, me and this kid, Trevor. And we just started talking about, Israel. And then he was going to Iraq, so I wanted to help him with that. Within 30 minutes, I said to him, and we built this friendship where I was like, would you come to Israel with me? Because I'm going alone and I don't know what I'm doing. And he said he will. He'll come. And I take that moment so lightly now, because I'm like, oh, wow, that worked out great. Because ultimately this guy called Trevor would come with me. We would rent a car and we would go to every single site. We went through the entire land, West Bank, Jerusalem, everywhere you could go, we went together, me and this kid. And,
wow.
And that's where my eyes opened up to wow, this land is incredible and amazing. And so many things were facilitated in the details that were already planned by God. In hindsight, I'm like, that worked out great.
Right.
But in that moment of time, I remember going, God,
in the end, you found Rebecca, right?
Yeah, yeah, which was a kid called Trevor with long blonde hair. Cool dude. And he's one of my best friends to this day. He's amazing. But what it tells us is that when you go on a task and you go, okay, God, this is your story, and I realize that I'm part of this story, but you're driving this, and I need you to figure out those details. And when I looked at this story, it's the same thing. There was a faith that Hashem, Adonai, would fill in the details of what is missing to us in that moment. And all it took was obedience, saying, this is your story. I'm trusting you. You're going to figure it out. And now I go. And I look at this figure of the servant that Abraham instructed to go and find Rebecca, and it's the same thing. He's like, I don't know what that's gonna look like physically, but I'm trusting and I'm going in the name of my master, and my master serves this God who says he works out the details. You just need to go. And so this, what seems like a pretty simple story, actually is quite powerful in the making of this union between Isaac and Rebecca. Now, what's amazing about that is the story is about Isaac and Rebecca coming together, right? And you just got this servant who was obedient. But the story is really about a servant being obedient to the call, getting no glory for it. He's not even going to be mentioned, right? Which makes it even more amazing. Let's say if it is Eliezer, the Bible's making a point now.
It's like, you don't need to know this person.
You don't need to know.
That's not the point.
Yes, the point is he went in the name of Adonai, and God filled in the details. And the story's not about him, it's about what God is doing. And now he participates in that story, and that's where the glory is. And so when we as believers go, oh, it's not about me, I'm in the story and God's going to work out the details, but ultimately it's not my story, it's his story. And when I get on board with that, then I actually get to see the glory of what he's doing.
I literally never thought about this until just now when you said that. The servant is actually a perfect parallel to Isaac himself, right? He's not getting the glory, but he's like in Isaac's case, he's following his father's will. In the servant's case, he's following his master's will. But both of them are relatively anonymous in contrast to Abraham, right? Like Isaac just does what Abraham says, but Abraham gets the glory. The servant just does what his master says, but Isaac and Rebecca are the ones who get the focus. Like the servant is the perfect foil for Isaac because, and he's the perfect person to find the partner for Isaac because Isaac's whole life is about doing the right thing, even though the right thing is unglamorous. And that's exactly what the servant does. I never thought about that until just now.
And it's powerful. It's a powerful reminder how God plays out a story going, Jesus always says, the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is not the person who's first, it's the person who's last. It's what makes God's economy and his kingdom of heaven so powerful. It's the people who are at the bottom who are doing these unglorified, they're not glorified in the same sense as the world, but they're doing something powerful. And it's the servitude and the person who's willing to do something without getting any of the glory, which is actually really great in God's eyes. And so the glory is in the story, but it's also about those who realize, like, if I can live a life of service and not want to be that person who's like, everyone wants to be Abraham. I'm the father of faith, or I want to be this guy. And really, it's like, no, I want to be the person who's obedient.
Yeah. You don't need to be the face on the t-shirt.
No.
Yeah.
No, exactly. Abraham dies.
The end.
Not funny. Not funny. Just it's sad. And here's the last thing I want to point out before we close this out. Abraham has another wife.
Yeah.
And more kids.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like, I'm curious because I'm like, okay, it's a detail that's in there. Why? Why is it important that we hear about kids that we're not going to really track in any great length? The story, we realize the story is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but we also see Abraham has another wife, he has more children, and then we go into sort of this, genealogy of
Ishmael.
Yeah. Why is that important to God?
So it's so interesting. I was just thinking about this. One theme of what we've talked about from the very beginning of this is the Bible wants to do two things. It wants to show you one specific story, and it also wants you to know that focusing on one specific story proves to you that every specific story actually matters in its own way. and each story, but they don't matter in the same way, right? Everyone's own unique history, story, background, skills, talents gives you a unique ability to do something in God's eyes. You know, there's a wonderful Hasidic tradition. So the Lubavitcher, there's a sect of Hasidim called the Lubavitcher Hasidim, and they're known as Chabad, kind of colloquially, and officially.
And they're everywhere.
And they're the best. This guy's the best.
Drove past one in Malibu not too long ago.
Oh,
That's
man.
the Chabad. It's like, good spot.
So the Chabad tradition, the tradition of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was like the last great leader of that group of Hasidim, take birthdays very seriously. Birthdays are not typically a major focus in the Jewish tradition. In fact, I had a teacher once who pointed out, he's like, you know, the only person who actually celebrates his birthday in the Bible? Pharaoh. So
not cool.
Yeah, not great, Bob.
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
but the Lubavitchers take birthdays very seriously, and the birthday greeting, it's reported in the name of the leader of the Chabad Hasidim, is happy birthday. Take this day to understand and to contemplate the fact that the day you were born was the day that God decided this world literally could not continue to function without you in it. And you're here for a purpose. So spend today trying to figure out what that purpose is. And that is distilled the biblical message, right? God focuses on the family of Abraham, the family of Isaac, the family of Jacob, of Sarah, of Rebecca, of Rachel, of Leah, and does so because God has a specific purpose in mind for them. God also has a specific purpose in mind for every single creation. I mean, for every blade of grass, let alone every single person. And so what we're being told here is, listen, Abraham had lots of children, and all of those stories are important, and each one of them actually does have a task in God's mind. And yet, at the same time, those tasks depend on the fulfillment of the task of Abraham and his family. So that's why we're going to keep following this story. It's basically a way of saying, I think, and at least my view, is that it's the Bible's way of saying, we want you to understand that Abraham and his children and Isaac and Jacob are not in a world that's totally separate from the rest of the world. They're part of a larger tapestry of nations. And all of those nations are important. And in fact, Abraham and his children have to carry out their mission in the world for the good of all of those nations. That's why the charge that God gives to Abraham at the very, very beginning of his encounter with him is be a blessing.
To all nations.
To all nations. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so you have to understand that Abraham's story is a part of the larger world, but it's also important for us to focus on that story. So it's kind of the Bible's way of saying, okay, we've told Abraham's story, it's part of a larger picture. That larger picture is crucially important. And the whole point of the story is to redeem and save that whole family of nations. And now we're going to return to the main story. I think that's the focus here. And the truth is, you know, over the course of a life of faith, we kind of have to remember that not to get tunnel vision, right? It's easy to get tunnel vision and say, listen, I'm just focused on my belief and fellow believers, and we're the only ones who matter, and we just got to focus on ourselves. And it's kind of easy to walk down the street and see all different types of people and feel like, all right, they don't matter. It's going to focus on my thing. And the truth is, if we learn anything from Lot, it's that you got to be careful who you associate with. It actually matters, not careful, but you have to be intentional about who you associate with. But even as we're remembering that, we cannot forget that the reason we care about this journey is because we actually care about God's redemption in the entire world. And it's important to remind us of that. And it's important for us to set that intentionality every single morning when we wake up. Just remind yourself, there's a reason I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, people matter.
Yeah.
And ultimately, God, you know, even at this point of the story, we realize that God still has this ultimate plan to make good on humanity. And this is just the beginning of seeing how that story goes in that direction. But there's still an inclusion of everybody that's, you know, indirectly involved in this story as still being figures and characters that we need to be aware of and conscious of. Even though the story is going this direction, there's God's ultimate plan, which is to restore and redeem a broken humanity.
Yeah.
And this is the road he's chosen to take that. And we follow along seeing how he's going to ultimately do that. It's almost like God has divided all these people to be separate from one another if we look at the Tower of Babel story. But his ultimate goal one day is he's going to bring everybody together. But the right reason isn't going to be a tower. It's going to be the glory of who he is. And that's being told through this specific story.
We did Isaac, man.
Yeah, we got Isaac.